we can assert pretty carefully that when someone walks in here, as opposed to our office halfway across the world, they're twice as likely to accept the offer that we've given them.
Welcome to The Visionaries. I'm your host, Nikki Greenberg. Today, I'm excited to introduce my friend, Phil Kirshner, an expert in employee experience, the future of work, and organizational effectiveness. Phil has held key roles at McKinsey, WeWork, and Credit Suisse, and brings a wealth of knowledge on how the physical office impacts work and productivity. In this episode, Phil shares his insights on how office design and functionality have evolved, especially post-pandemic, and how organizations can rethink their workspaces to foster collaboration, innovation, and a strong employee experience. Get ready to dive deep into the future of office space and how you can make your work environment a true asset in your business. Before diving into this episode, make sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so that you never miss an update. Phil, I am so glad to have you here today for this very important discussion.
Thank you, Nick. I'm so glad to be here.
So Phil, tell us, what are we talking about today? What is that instrumental moment in time that's really redefined how you think about office and that's change that's happening in the world?
Thanks. When I fell into workplace, I say sometimes I'm an accidental workplace strategist. I learned on the backs of the thousands of consultants and experts who came before me that the sort of advanced office projects, let's say 10, 15, 20 years ago, pre-COVID, were largely oriented on making the office that we had to go to be a better place to work. So resolving the problem that for most people, most of the activities that they did most of the day weren't really that well supported. And understanding the differences between, are you sitting in the open? Are you a manager? Do you have an office? New or more modern places, older places, and like all sorts of styles, but ultimately anchoring on making the activities that you're doing more effective. And I have found through my consulting work in the last few years, especially with COVID, a real shift in mentality for me that the answer to a lot of the problems that in particular occupiers are facing and trying to understand the role of the office and how to build a place that is efficient and effective and leads to better productivity, but also drives a positive employee experience, is ultimately defining and maybe narrowing the purpose of those places and shifting from, I try to make it as functional as I can for as many of the things that you do while you're here because you're stuck here, to something that's much more like retailer hospitality oriented to say, we are going to anchor on a select number of things to be amazing while you're here and to communicate that, to design for it, to activate it, and let go of the fact that the office has to solve for everything.
And I'm with you on that. I get a little bit miffed when I hear these discussions about the future of office and what office needs to be today, because there's this ask of it to be all things to all people. I'm like, but everybody's job is different. The tasks that we do in a day need different spaces and different interactions. And me as an architect, I always go back to design principles, and I always talk about Mies van der Rohe. And he says, form ever follows function. So as the function of work changes and the tasks that we do, or as you say, the activities that we do changes, I believe we need to design the spaces around being optimal for those tasks. So how do you start thinking about this notion that you described, where when you think about office, whether it was 15 years ago when it really was that digital age that we're talking about, versus today when we're talking about this new frontier, we're talking about the AI age and the activities that people do on a daily basis in their jobs, what was that kind of shift? Or how do you think about that shift around creating the right space for the tasks that people are doing in their jobs?
Yeah. So the years ago version, which I find is informative to leaders who are wrestling still with office design today and weren't really thinking about it before, at its simplest, was usually a series of questions around how important it is to you as an individual or as a team to do a certain number of activities, as I said, and then how well whatever you're sitting in at the moment, which now also could be your house, helps you perform that thing, right? That was the heart of the question. Not, do you like the color of the wall? Not, do you like your coworkers? But like workplace effectiveness. Do you have to concentrate? Yes, no. If yes, how well can you do that in your office? Right? That was the basic of almost every program, as I said, trying to solve for as many individual needs as we could. COVID in particular, outlets like Leesman, probably the most famous, quoted early on, showed really quickly how much disparity there was in the performance of most people's office, just the average office before COVID and right in the early pandemic time, and then their homes. And trying to communicate to leaders, most of the reason that most people aren't rushing back in even after we got through the sort of core pandemic phase is simply that when they tally up all the things they have to do, their house does more of them better than the office. And even where there might be like a close race, then they're just layering in, well, like my kid's here, or I've got to commute an hour and I have to spend more money. And when I get there, because of the evolving nature of work and the ways that the pandemic sort of exacerbated some of our pre-existing cultural problems, I'm on Zoom all day long. So why would I do all that? And the inertia is just really strong, so I stay here. As I said, for looking forward, and I'm as guilty as anybody of having done this in the past, of saying, like, why do we have an office in New York? Because we have 500 people in New York. That answer is not good enough now. So we're seeing more leaders anchoring, at least in the basics of, we're building places so that we can collaborate together, so that we can improve social capital and build our culture and mentor our new employees. And I encourage them to think even more specifically, to say, like, what does collaborate mean for you? As a fabulous example I cite all the time about life sciences firm, that instead of just saying we're coming to collaborate, which is pretty generic, we're here to accelerate clinical speed, which is basically collaborate, but it's very specific and authentic to them and their employees. And to answer your question on sort of the role of AI, I said recently in a post something about like AI influencing design of the office, and a few people came back at me saying, like, how is AI going to inform how we design the office? I don't think it's going to inform the office directly, other than for architects, right, who are using it now in their process. But I encourage leaders to really, you have to think through what is the sort of Horizon 2, Horizon 3 impact of what AI is going to do to the nature of work in your company, to further tease out not only what is possible to do in a distributed manner, which still doesn't necessarily mean from home, but to find the core meaningful activities that you want people in the same place at the same time for. And not just design places for that, but ultimately activate them. That was a bit of the WeWork magic. What are you experiencing in WeWork? It's not just a place that's been designed for collaboration, but everything happening around you. The community manager, the music, the furniture moving, the events. That's actually driving the engine that makes employees want to be there for the activity that you have decided is the priority in that particular place. Maybe as a final thought, also knowing in a city like New York, if you don't think your office can provide every one of those activities, there may be plenty of other places that your employees can be or go on a regular or periodic basis to do that. That's not yours. Doesn't have to be yours all the time.
That's brilliant. And if I might surmise from this great introduction that you've given, it sounds like there's some key principles that you're really pulling out. Now, number one, understanding these activities that encompass, what a certain company actually thinks of as being work. What are those activities? What are those tasks? Number two, going deeper into understanding what are those activities. Number three, considering what is collaboration? What does collaboration mean to you? And again, going deeper. Number four, understanding community, activity, the interaction, the vibe. Like, how does it feel to work in this space? Do people like it? Are they inspired? Are they bored? Do they feel ill? Like, what is that sense of things? And then, maybe the fifth principle would be having that Horizon 2, Horizon 3, and not just being complacent, because to your point, when we have these new tools in place like AI, and increasingly we will have robotics, we will have more clean technologies, we will have an evolving landscape of technologies, not just thinking about what are our needs today, how do we work today, but how are we going to work in the future, and how is this changing environment going to impact us so that we can be future ready? Is there anything that I've missed in there that you think is just so key that we need to pull out?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. And maybe on that last point, like space doesn't move that fast yet, right? I'm not saying we can solve for everything tomorrow, but if you have alignment with your leadership about the direction of travel, right? We used to be going east, and now we're going west. So let's just make sure it's directionally this way. That you're testing and learning and trialing new concepts like as best as you can within the reality that you have today that is keeping you on the path you want to be, and just making sure you're not going backwards or allowing yourself to do something that runs counter to that vision that you're setting. And maybe a final point, like the largest or most visible real estate projects that I have encountered recently in client work have this funny common question that comes from sort of the leadership that I don't hear in smaller, less significant, more traditional projects, which is simply, how am I going to know that it worked? And they'll be able to articulate, like, why did we make the decision to do the project, right? We're uptown, we're not downtown. There's a reason for that. Maybe even, you mentioned sort of sustainability and green technologies. There's excellent stories about how the construction is being done. We've made lots of choices along the way, what we're reclaiming, what we're reusing, how we're providing materials, like excellent. Great. We're going to open and everyone's going to say, this is amazing. It's new. It's shiny. But a year after that, how are you going to be able to say it worked? And that comes back to this question of purpose, right? If you say, I want this building to like accelerate clinical speed, or I want it to double the acceptance rate for candidates, right? Are you getting everyone around the table and making sure you understand what those numbers are before, some of which you may have to, cobble together. They may not be so straightforward. And keeping an eye on it to be able to say when the dust settles a year later and it's no longer the shiny new toy, can you say, yeah, we built sustainably. Yes, it's more efficient. There's fewer square feet per person than there was before, but actually we can assert pretty carefully that when someone walks in here, as opposed to our office halfway across the world, they are twice as likely to accept the offer that we've given them. Like we can show it. That kind of using the purpose to define the metrics and really the dashboard that defines the success of the building, and almost imagining from every quarter after a building or a campus, whatever it is, opens. Can you sit down with your building, like across the table, and say, like, hello, New York office, time for our quarterly business review or quarterly building review, QBR. And like, how have you done lately? Not how many employees are showing up. Are the employees happy? But can the building justify its own purpose and be able to react more quickly? If it's not, what are you going to do? And the answer may not be buy new chairs. It's probably getting leadership to both sort of physically and metaphorically show up in a different way than they were to make whatever activity you decided is important true to get to the business outcome that you want. And that's hard, and it runs counter to the architecture and construction industry that wants to point to the building and say, ta-da! Like, it's big, it's beautiful, it's amazing, it's sustainable, but not. I can prove that it's good for the business, and when it stops being good for the business, do we not necessarily like walk away or knock down the building, but are we holding the building accountable, not just the people?
I love this notion of actually personifying the building and thinking of it in terms of, in the same way as you have an employee performance review, why not have a building performance review on a regular basis? And this to me is a very novel approach, but I think it's also an approach that's very simple for any manager or any leader to visualize, because in a similar way as with an employee, they have a role description. They know what their KPIs are. They're reviewed on a regular basis. And if things aren't working, then you adjust. And I love buildings. I'm an architect. And actually, I'm a unique architect because I'm an architect that went to business school. So when you're talking about this relationship between this physical space and performance and business outcomes, this is speaking very much to something that's very close to my heart.
Yeah.
So this notion of, if I can paraphrase, understanding, what is the purpose? Why are we running this project? What are we looking to achieve? What does success look like? Putting some metrics in place. Those metrics might be around attendance, happiness, energy reduction, financial metrics, whatever it might be. But the third piece that I might put in is also kind of front ending that, is also having that notion of a vision. And both you and I we're strategists. So we're used to putting these documents together. And what I always find is when you have this very simple vision statement, it's something that's very touchy-feely for people. And when you say, okay, the purpose of our space is that, and we can refer back to your life sciences one, for example, the purpose of this space is that the greatest minds will be able to collaborate on life-changing projects and be inspired every day to do so.
Yeah.
That becomes kind of touchy-feely. It's like, okay, well, how do we do this? Greatest minds. Well, hold a sec. We need to make sure that our workplace is attractive to the best in the business because that's who we're trying to attract. What does it feel like to come in? We're not talking about gray walls. We're talking about something that's really going to pull them in and go, hey, you know what? This isn't just a functional space. This is a space that is actually going to support peak performance, creativity, other things in there, not just outcomes. So these kind of emotional keywords, even though they can seem fuzzy, but they actually start pulling out that next order of what are we doing? What are we trying to do? And how do we differentiate our space to be the best in the business for business outcomes, mind you?
Totally. And you just on the touchy-feely point, you made me think of, I did a lot of work at McKinsey on what's called their organizational health index, and found myself explaining quite often the difference between that instrument, which you can look up, it's like almost 25 years old now, and engagement surveys. And actually was involved with a project with a real estate company where in advance of using that survey instrument for whatever they were doing, there was a concern like, is this touchy-feely? I said, well, when you do an engagement survey, you are asking someone, how do you feel today? And while that may be valid and there's lots of benefit for higher employee engagement, a lot of leaders go, well, it's, as you said, it's sort of squishy. The organizational health index, by comparison, the vast majority of the questions are about employees' perceived frequency of seeing something happening around them, which is a lot more objective. You ask me, like, do you see leaders of a certain level visibly in the open, as something as simple as just like holding meetings in lounges or using all the cool tech? Do you see it? And some of them will say, oh yeah, all the time. And others will say, never. Even that question alone is much less touchy-feely. So when you define the purpose, is like, not just that we want to attract the best scientists, but we want to create moments where teams who do different things are like visibly and in an engaging fashion sharing ideas. And then you could ask everyone, do you see it? And if the answer is no, again, it doesn't mean that your beautiful innovation space is broken. It may be that literally the heads of those departments are not being held accountable for going to those spaces and doing the thing that they're supposed to do. So it's way beyond the design. Like, are you changing the performance management expectations of the leaders whose day-to-day activities may be required, or certain day-to-day activities may be required to achieve the business outcome that you want your building to be able to brag about at the next review?
And that's 100%, and that's behavioral change. And in the environment, you'll often have cues to encourage things, but as people, we're very habitual. So we'll often default to what we know, which might be sitting at the same desk, keeping 9 to 5, using the same meeting room, because you know what? We don't like change. And from a cognitive place, it actually takes more energy for our brains to do something different. So we default to our normal patterns. So we can provide the latest and greatest space, but what we need to do is go, okay, how do we change somebody's behaviors? And I'll tell you one of my favorite buildings, and I've been using this as a case study for years and years and years. In 2019, I visited the new Microsoft building in Amsterdam, and this was pre-COVID, and they wanted to move to remote work. And this is so damn obvious, but it was so effective. What they did is that they shut down the office entirely for 2 months because they had to do construction. Everybody had to work from home. So during those 2 months, people were forced to change their way of working. So when people came to the office, they were so used to remote working anyway. And this is that behavioral experiment that we went through with COVID, that people were forced to work at home. They got used to that pattern. But I think what we haven't had is that behavioral change of how do you use these new offices? Try something out, test things out. We've got to disrupt the default way of working or way of thinking or doing when there is a better way. It's a relearning in this new world of work. But Phil, I might change gears a little bit because you did reference it earlier, and it's something that I kind of skipped over, but I just think it's so important. We've been talking about the office, but obviously having, a third space, it might be a cafe, or it might be a co-working space that you jump into every so often, or a library. Great. I sometimes work from the bank, quite literally.
Where we met the first time?
Exactly. You visited me at what's kind of known as like Nikki's office, which is a certain corner in a cafe in Capital One Bank in Midtown. I sometimes also work from Equinox, where they have a shared space there. I work from cafes. I love it, absolutely love it. But when it comes to the home office, what are some of the tips that you can give individuals? Because right now, pretty much everyone has a home office, and it's something that they can relate to. What are some of the tips and insights that you can share with people about setting up that optimal home office environment for creativity, lessening procrastination, increasing inspiration, or just any insights that you can share with people? People love tips. What tips do you have?
Sure. I'd say the simplest, what we found early COVID, the major differentiating factor, like, can you actually get something done? I am very fortunate at the moment that I'm sitting in a small room with a door just over there. And the door's closed, and I'm sitting in a chair, an iron chair, like a real chair, at a desk that goes up and down with 2 screens and a light and a camera and a mouse that I love and all the things and a dock and a bunch of cables. Like, I've done all that. That's just, can you bring your home to the level of general infrastructure that you might expect in an office for a workstation, like a real workstation? And that's super hard because we live in New York City and not a lot of people have that luxury. I'm very fortunate to be able to have that. And I think we will increasingly see some of this enterprise tech making its way into the home, and more people who are willing to figure out how to do it, or maybe even services to help. Maybe it's something, I think it was like 95% sure it was Facebook early on in COVID that was, using the intellect and capability of their internal design team, who was, for the moment, not doing very much, to help people with exactly that problem in their home. Not only with we can give you discounts on things, but sharing best practices and encouraging employees to, and I still see it, share pictures. This is my setup. This is what it looks like. I found this product. It's great. We do that all the time for non-work products in my home. I love this pen. I love this knife. I love this toaster. We're used to it, but it's the application of that sort of sharing for work that's new, which, similar to your point about using third spaces, we move around the world all the time doing all sorts of things, going to restaurants and sporting events, and we travel and we book hotels. We do all that. We're just not used to applying that mentality transactionally, for work. But coming back to space, because people don't all have it, I think we will, and actually here in New York, we see this trend where newer, not just gyms and bank branches and libraries and community centers, but new condo buildings are leaning in a little bit to co-working or working, or saying, look, maybe we have a meeting room, or we have a lounge with a phone booth or 2 that didn't cost as much extra to put there. But if you've got 2 kids and a dog, and someone's in your house, and your partner works, and you both work, and someone's got to just get out of Dodge, that you don't also have to leave the building. And maybe that's very compelling. Will we start to see more, more floor plans for more apartments explicitly calling out, not just this is where you do laundry, but this could be your home office. And maybe we put in we talked about network connectivity, we put in hardwired network into your apartment. It's there. You don't have to do it, because it makes it compelling to work from home when you want to, right? Without any implication you have to.
Yeah. And that acknowledgement that it's become part of life, and homes evolve, buildings evolve, get with the trends.
Yeah. And that's just the banking example. The hardest thing for a lot of offices, I think, to realize, are companies say, oh, our office is amazing. So, but do you realize between Nikki's house and your office, she's passing that like bank branch, which is also a co-working space. She's passing her gym, which has a reasonably good workplace. She's passing her friend's house, which is like a really awesome lobby where she hangs out at the hotel. There's 50 other things that are workplaces between her and you. You have to be better than all of them for whatever she's doing that day in order to kind of deserve or provide a return on her commute to you.
So, Phil, when you're working with organizational leaders and you're bringing in new ideas and saying to them, the way you used to do things doesn't necessarily apply today. You need to change. And you mentioned it already, saying that you need a North Star, you need a strategy to at least know what direction you're going in. How do you overcome resistance when it comes up? How do you manage to keep people focused on where you're going instead of slipping back to where you've been?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. It is change management. Change management, even as a concept to a lot of people, like an engagement survey, can feel touchy-feely. It's like, and they think change management, and it equates to them as like, oh, we do a couple town halls, we send some emails, we give people a free T-shirt on their new day, right? That's change management. But I fell in love years ago with a change framework that we used sort of institutionally at JLL, but I've applied to other places. That's much more of a use of resistance, like resistance mitigation instead of change management. And you can usually, or I found you get leaders much more on board with that to say, like, let's enumerate all the things that might prevent you from achieving the statements that you've already made about the desired outcome. And some of them might be human behavior. Right? You've said you're going to reduce offices or put things more in the open. So one problem you might encounter, doesn't mean you will, but you might, is that your top 50 senior people are grumpy about that particular decision. And if you think the likelihood of that risk is very high, or basic risk management, you can apply some measures, coaching, extra conversations, making sure they have somewhere to vent in private. But others might be, you're going to train all your new people or the people you have now to drive this fancy new car you're giving them that has no steering wheel. It's some fancy new office, right? Retrain them. That's great. What happens to the people that you hire the day after you open the place? What about them? Are you thinking about the training measures, the metrics and monitoring, or new roles and responsibilities that need to be in place in order to ensure you achieve your objectives? And that kind of both more database-oriented focus on resistance mitigation instead of like change management, I have found to be a little easier to kind of message with leaders. And also just whether it's AI and hybrid and remote and all of it, the pace of change, is definitely getting faster. And the old idea of change management, like we're moving from point A to point B and then we are done, is not practical anymore. Like you need a muscle for resilience to change. And that's a radically different leadership style that manifests in almost anything you read now about, like whether it's managing in hybrid, managing in AI, managing an increasingly distributed workforce, managing like contract workers. It's just how adaptable are you to evolving situations and making it more of a mindset or a muscle, like a flywheel for change, and not just I go from here to here and I'm out. That's what I found to be effective, but it is ultimately hard because when you're talking about work, it runs a fine line between what I think as a business leader and what I think as a human. It is personal. Where I sit, where I go, who I'm next to, what I hear, how I have to travel. It's right on that line of like my work-life balance. It's not like telling me, you used to have this email application, now you have this one, and IT is changing it. You're like, that's annoying. But whatever. It's business. You tell me where I have to sit. That's personal.
Yeah. And you make a few quite interesting points. Firstly, not just measuring success, but also measuring resistance, identifying what might be those inhibitors to success, and being realistic about it, addressing it, nipping it in the bud, constantly evaluating it and making sure that you're bringing everybody on the journey, that you're not just going, it's a small group, like, let's not worry about them, like, let's focus, 80-20 rule is like, no. That 20 could actually be the make or break of your project. let's find those inhibitors, let's actively work on it and constantly monitor, improve, and so on. Secondly, you bring up another very interesting point about understanding that people move on in jobs. You might train your team that's part of this, this office transformation to be able to understand the best way to use a space, and then they leave it a week later and the new person comes in without training in how to use that space. So actually that constant refresh of understanding who's coming in is also a very interesting point that you make. And just generally understanding that change is ongoing. And one of the questions that I'm often faced with, especially being in the real estate development side of things, is this concept around sunk costs and a concern of saying, well, we don't necessarily want to invest in something new because in 3 months' time or 6 months' time, there's going to be something better. So why don't we wait? Why don't we see what everybody else is doing? And blah, 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 blah. How do you overcome that resistance to change and the notions around sunk costs? And again, that default of going, well, let's just stick to what we've always done instead of doing something new, which is risky. How do you overcome that apprehension?
Yeah, I mean, the benefit now, a former boss told me once that like when you get a black eye in real estate, it lasts for a decade. And you're like, Nikki, she signed that lease 8 years ago and we're still living in it. And it's terrible. Curses, Nikki. Why did you do that? You can't get away from it. And so the corporate real estate profession is really risk averse, right? And just from the occupier side, that always led to usually excess space. Right? Like, we might grow. We have to grow, so we have to take more. And the idea that you could be responsive to growth or changing work patterns, you would never pay attention to it because you couldn't act on it. The same reason that a lot of real estate teams would never ask employees for feedback. Like, I don't want to ask them what they think about this place or how functional it is, because if they tell me, they're going to know I know, and I still can't do anything about it. It's not just a sunk cost, but I physically do not have the capital to spend to fix something that they tell me about. So it's like doubly so. But now, you're starting to see this before COVID with WeWork and a lot of serviced office, especially again in a city like New York. If you're not sure, solve for 60, 70% of what you know or things you are most sure about. And then don't be afraid of having to kind of have some flexibility around the margin, whether that's sharing in your own office or declaring the purpose, right? We're good at these things. And for these other activities, we're going to support them, but we're not trying to make them an A+. And that you can, reach into flexible pools of occupancy, whether that's you and me meeting at a Capital One cafe or some project team taking a WeWork site for a month because they need it, or in a city like New York and London and many others, that's possible. There's such a supply. Why try to solve for 100% and not to be afraid of living a little bit in the red line? And I think that contributed a lot to the feeling at WeWork, where executives would come and tour, not just a normal WeWork, but our office. They're like, why does it feel so buzzy? Because we are okay living a little bit full and figuring out in that moment, not only what to do about it, but I think behaviors get more interesting when there's supply constraint. And so instead of having an empty office where you've got all this sunk cost, close the site, remove the chairs, do whatever you got to do to stack people in so you'll really see what their behaviors are, and then not be afraid to say, especially now, okay, we're going to put 20 of you out literally outside the building, or you stay from home just for a bit while we sort this out instead of carrying the sunk cost.
I love that notion. It's not just about flexibility. It's also about ambiguity. And
totally.
Because again, we tend to get into this default mode of saying, maybe we have 10 desks in an office. Do you need 10? What happens if you only have one desk? Can people share that desk? Are they going to maybe use other places in the office? What else can we do? Because this notion of being able to understand where things are going, we don't know what the future is. And that's the big thing. And whenever I give talks about the future of office, everybody, usually the number one question is people put up their hands and they go, so yeah, everything you've told me about changing expectations and new generations and technology and blah, 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 and the way we work, that's all great. But just tell me the one thing that I need to do. Just tell me that one tangible thing that's going to solve all of my problems all at once. And I'm like, there is no magic bullet. There is no magic wand. The only thing you can do is be flexible and be open-minded. And one of the other saving graces, I believe, in addition to what you were talking about with flexibility and understanding that you can have runoff space in other areas outside of the 4 walls or 17 walls of your office, whatever shape it might be, is also understanding that having software rather than hardware also provides opportunities. And that's what I think is something that's quite exciting. So there's so many different, XaaS, whatever as a service, whether it's hiring furniture or a space or booking a meeting room or this or whatever. We didn't have these opportunities 5-10 years ago. So we do have this opportunity now to shift our mindset from these, fixed sunk costs, trying to deal with ambiguity. I think the only way we can deal with ambiguity is through flexibility. And there's that beautiful relationship between the two. And again, Phil, as I said, I love talking to you because every time you say something, I'm like, oh my God, you're seeing what I'm seeing through a different lens, and then some, and then some. So
I'm so glad. Yeah, right. As much as can change in, and just maybe you hear the phrase "fail fast" like all over, especially when it comes to technology. If you say "fail fast" to a facilities manager, they're like have a heart attack right in front of you. But we've got to change that. Like it's okay that we did that thing. It didn't work. Nobody liked it, so we changed it. And that's also very engaging for the occupants. Right? You're listening to me, so I'm okay living a little bit in this liminal space of like, things are changing, but like it's for the better. It's not a 10-year lease and then another 10-year lease and another 10-year lease, and we only do this once a decade when none of us are still here.
Yeah. And you know what? And we fail fast at home. We fail fast in our home offices. And I don't know about you, but the number of times that I've moved my furniture around or tried a different camera or a different setup or a different mic, I'm like, I'm always playing. I'm always experimenting. And quite honestly, I'm also always going to the fridge when I'm in my home office. But for some reason,
half the stuff in front of me I'm looking at now was completely different 18 months ago. Totally.
Well, that's it. And I think we've got this weird mentality around work that everybody needs to use the exact same tools, no matter what your job is. We're all on the Microsoft suite. We're all using our calendars in this way. And it's but we're all individuals. And, if we can have this area for what I call playfulness, where we get to experiment with the stuff that actually suits us to be able to do our jobs, that's what we've got to allow for. We've got to allow for this, not just, ambiguity and flexibility, and I do call it playfulness because what we need to be able to do is understand, okay, well, today there might be XYZ tool, and tomorrow there's going to be something that's from another provider, but 10 times better and half the cost. And you've got to be able to switch over. You've got to be able to embrace what's new, what's next. Because I don't know about you, but it's like, I'll make a decision when I leave my home. I'm like, am I getting a taxi? Am I walking? Am I getting a Lyft? Am I getting an Uber? I've got this menu of options and I just choose the one that's best for me at that moment in time. I'm not I have to get into the company bus and go in this one direction. Life moves, life changes. And as individuals, we need to be empowered to be able to use the technology and the space and design the way that we want to interact with the world so that we can be effective in the way that we need to be according to what we need to do instead of being put in this very closed box, which I believe doesn't serve us anymore in the 2020s.
Yeah. And that's a whole other podcast, but just say we have to operate in much more of a virtual first or remote first manner, even when we are intending to be together. Because as you said, there's the odds that you can get exactly the number of people that you think in exactly the place at exactly the time when flexibility is so easy, right? Someone gets sick, you're not working, whatever it is, that you're still operating from a ways of working perspective of being flexible to that. Oh, Nikki's not here? Great. We're using digital tools anyway. The whiteboard, it's not a real whiteboard, it's a digital whiteboard. We pre-recorded this. We had the agenda. It's fine. We would have loved her here, but she happens not to be. Cool. She's probably doing something that's good for her. And the business will keep moving. We're not slowing down.
Yeah. And I think that then there do become these exceptions, such as having a company offsite or a conference where it's okay, this is the time of year where everybody turn your emails off. No one's responding. We're doing that. Or some companies I've heard of recently, I'm not going to mention it by name, but quite a large investment manager, they actually mandate when people take leave over the summer holidays because they say, look, we're shutting down for these 2 weeks. take your leave now, because we don't want to be in a position where it's like, oh, like half here, half there, blah, blah, blah. It's like, just take the time off, closed, and, come back after Labor Day, and then we're back. And just provides us, this sense of certainty. I mean, it's a bit of an old school,
but we're okay with that.
Or work environment, but
it's
a different way of working to get, I like workplace experiments, like try something and see how it works, just operate in a different way. And you might be surprised by the results.
And being transparent, right? If I was applying to a company, like right there in the front, not just, we have a great workplace, but like literally this is what it feels like to work here. These 2 weeks of every year, the whole company shuts down, period. Like if that's not cool for you, like, don't apply.
Yeah. And, then you can plan for it. I think there's this mix of, what is fixed and what is flexible. And I do like those examples of companies that say, okay, we have mandatory, like an overlap in the workday of when there's meetings available. And then you can work either side of that, but just know that we run meetings where everybody needs to be available so we can collaborate between, say, 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. But if you want to start early, end early, doesn't matter. Just please make yourself available at this overlap time, because to have that sense of certainty helps a lot with being able to coordinate yourself rather than the kind of free for all. But we are getting into a lot of so many different work practices that I think you and I can geek over. But I might finish up, Phil, by just asking a few kind of rapid fire questions to get a sense of like how you work in a day. Short answers to begin with. Are you a morning person or a night owl? When do you do your best work?
I think I'm inherently a night owl. It's when I get left alone. And as a computer science major, I did most of my work in college like over after midnight in a lab. So that's when I could be most productive.
How do you structure your day? How do you structure your week?
I wish I had some stability in that right now. Like being on my own, it's a bit fluid in part because of kids back at school. I've got a dog. My wife is building a business, and I don't rely on weekly structure at the moment. I wish I could, but one day.
It sounds like you're more task oriented.
More task oriented, yes, and planning ahead a couple of days.
Right. So when you're stuck, do you actively seek a solution, or do you give it time and space?
I like to stew on stuff. It's good time for dog walks and being able to think and take notes to find the right solution. I'm sort of a history oriented guy, so think.
Which philosophers, theorists, or inventors inspire you?
Well, in the workplace line of work, it's hard to avoid Maslow, Abraham Maslow, right? Hierarchy of needs, because it very much plays into work. I stand on the shoulders of people like Frederick Taylor, who was the original Taylor's measurement of productivity at work and time studies. It feels kind of arcane, but that is basically what we're still asking for with productivity. And maybe a sort of family shout out. Someone I always respected before I married into the family, but my wife's grandmother is Felice Schwartz, who was sort of the leader in the role and equality for women in the workplace, which is so much still important and directly related to conversations around remote work. So those three.
What technology do you use to stay efficient, and are there any AI tools that you're currently testing out?
Depending on what I'm doing, my kind of general productivity tech stack is a mix of Evernote, Airtable, Notion, and Todoist, depending on kind of what I'm tracking. For AI, trying to play with as many things as I can. I've currently replaced my default search engine, at least in Chrome, with Perplexity instead of Google, so that's forcing me to use it more. Claude is one I want to start playing with more than I have already versus ChatGPT or Gemini. And also just being turned on recently to more the writing-oriented apps, Grammarly in a way, like WriteSonic, a few of those to help with sort of social media or writing.
And finally, how do you believe that we will work in the future, and how should we prepare as individuals and as organizations?
Oh, that's a big question. If you agree directionally with the way I think we're going, right, work is going to keep getting broken down into little bits, bytes, chunks, and activities, and more technically supported and more not necessarily remote, but distributable, and having little AI coaches helping with everything. So if you believe in that future, we got to be arming today's leaders for that discomfort and constant change, and thinking more atomically about work, and encouraging people, maybe even to gig on the side, right? You and I have independent businesses. Even if you're employed, you should try that and try selling something even for $5, right? That's a little gig because we're going to need it and our kids are going to need it in the future. That's like what I think is inevitable.
Yeah, I think the picture I have is almost, these bubbles of tasks that need to be done. And
I love it.
In my case, it's like, I have a podcast, just send out, create a podcast for Nikki, invite Phil as a guest. And I know that somebody else can take care of everything and is all onto brand. It's all in the style we want, etc. That's one person's thing. Other tasks, accounting, etc. These bubbles that can kind of pick up, do it to your standard and do it in the way that you like. Phil, this has been an absolutely wonderful conversation. I know we could have gone on for a few more hours, but we'll get together for coffee or drinks anyway.
100%.
And keep chatting.
Find you in your office.
Excellent.
Thank you, Nikki.
Well, thanks so much. And Phil, where can people find you if they want to connect with you?
LinkedIn is the easiest way. I'm a top voice there and very active on the platform. So just LinkedIn, Phil Kirshner. First one will come up. Or philkirshner.com.
Brilliant. So good to chat.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Phil Kirshner for joining us on The Visionaries and sharing his expert insights on the future of work and office design. If you're enjoying the podcast or finding it valuable, please consider rating or reviewing. It really helps us reach more listeners and spread these inspiring stories. Don't forget to share this episode with friends or colleagues who are passionate about workplace innovation and employee experience. You can also stay connected with me on LinkedIn or YouTube at Nikki Greenberg. Thanks again for tuning in, and I look forward to having you join us for the next episode.